Well, welcome. I'm really glad that you are joining us online for our podcast. My name is Joel, and I am the pastor here at Paris Community Church. As a church, we are for Paris, which means that we want to be for our community. We want to be for you because we believe that God is for us as well. If you're looking for the full service, you can jump back to our YouTube channel and you can get songs and prayers included as well. One of the things that we really value as a church is building community. And we're so excited you took this first step of connecting with us. If you'd like to connect with us a little bit more, may I suggest you sign up for our e-blast. You can jump onto our website, you can click on the link, and within 15 seconds, you'll be signed up. And what the e-blast does is it provides you more information around things that are happening or have happened in the life of our church. It's also a means of us to communicate back and forth a little bit more. Oftentimes I give additional content and thoughts around the weekly teaching. But we're glad that you're joining us. We hope this is helpful. We hope that this builds hope. We hope this creates a space for you to encounter more of God with you in the midst of wherever you are in life or in faith. Thanks for joining us. So I'm pretty confident that no matter who you are, the fact that we may have never even met, no matter how old, no matter how young, that we all share something in common. And what it is this. We have all messed up. We have all made mistakes in life. And don't worry, this is not like time to confess your sins or I'll be sharing my deepest, darkest secrets. But we've all made mistakes in life. Today we're wrapping up a series on defining moments. And the reality is how we all have these moments in life that are significant. That can begin to shape us. And so my question for us to consider and to reflect upon is not rather have you messed up, not have you made mistakes, but rather how have you responded to them? I think unfortunately too often we see in the midst of mistakes, in the midst of mess ups, they can become these defining moments negatively, where we get buried by a sense of guilt and shame. We almost take on an identity that we are a failure, that this mistake is starting to define me. But have you ever considered that this doesn't have to be the case? For us, one of the things that we continually want to come back to is the good news of Jesus, how Jesus makes a difference in the midst of all of life. And today I want to hone in on the reality that in the midst of our mistakes, in the midst of our mess ups, they can become a defining moment, not negatively, but actually positively. If we allow Jesus to enter into the biggest mistakes and mess ups of our life. You see, one of the keys for us as a church is to just understand that we come and we gather and we talk about Jesus, not because we're perfect, not because we have it all figured out, but because nobody's perfect. Oftentimes when I think of the church should do less kind of pointing of the finger and more welcoming, more waving, more inviting people to come in, particularly in the midst of our mistakes and our mess ups. You see, the motivation to follow Jesus should never be one of guilt or shame. And so how is it? How is it that Jesus begins to make a difference in the midst of our mistakes, in the midst of our incredible mess ups? Today I want to take just a moment to go back and to look at the person of Peter. Now, I'm not sure how familiar you are with the Bible or different people in the Bible, but Peter was a fairly significant and prominent figure in the midst of Jesus' ministry. He was one of the inner three. He was one that was inspired by God to write parts of the New Testament, letters to the early Christians that we still read and study today. Peter actually is the one that we name schools after and churches after, and a lot of people name kids after him. I mean, I'm sure all of us know a Peter in our life. Well, you back it up all the way, where did that name originate? You start to see that Peter had quite the legacy. And I think sometimes the challenges for us is when you start to read the Bible and you read some of the characters in the Bible, you become a little bit overwhelmed. You almost see them as like super followers of Jesus, that they are incredible, that they can be used by God, that they probably never made mistakes or ever messed up. And that's why they're so faithful. But as you dig into the story, you begin to realize that wasn't the case. I want to take you back for a moment to set up a significant encounter that Jesus had with Peter. And the moment was on the night when Jesus was arrested. It was a time of total chaos and confusion. The disciples, those who loved Jesus, were losing their mind. And what's interesting is as Jesus was being condemned, as he was being arrested, many of his disciples started to kind of step back a little bit. Now, I'm speculating, but part of it, I believe, is because they were afraid of what was going to happen to them. And then we read this encounter in the Bible, whereas Jesus is being brought before the authorities, as the crowds are beginning to gather, some of them begin to notice who Peter is. And some of them actually begin to say, hey, aren't you one of them? Aren't you one of the followers of Jesus? And Peter, flipping out, is like, no, I don't know the man. But it doesn't happen once, it happens twice. It happens a third time. And it's on the third time that Peter, trying to distance himself from Jesus, actually begins to curse his name. This only comes on the heels of hours earlier. Peter was adamant before Jesus that he would never disown him. That even if everyone else divided and fled him, that he would be with him even unto death. Clearly, Peter wasn't true to his word. And when the rooster crowed the third time, he was crushed. Luke actually tells us that Peter went outside the city and began to weep bitterly. Just imagine what Peter must have been experiencing. He had let Jesus down. He had failed Jesus in the hour of his greatest need. That even though Jesus had been faithful, Peter fell apart. Yet when you go to the end of the story, you start to see how faithful Peter was. And so the question is, how did Peter go from failure to faithful follower of Jesus? What was it that made such a significant difference? And I think this is so important for us to lean in, because perhaps you're there now, or perhaps there's been something in your past that is defining you, that is actually preventing you from fully experiencing this good news of Jesus in the midst of your life. That like Peter, you're kind of been pushed to the sidelines. You feel a sense of shame and a sense of guilt, and if only you could do it over again. But as we look to the story of Peter, we believe to see this incredible defining moment of how our failures can actually allow us to become a faithful follower of Jesus. So jump ahead. Peter had denied Jesus. Jesus died on the cross. They were overwhelmed with a sense of guilt. Then Jesus rose again, and Jesus began to appear to his disciples. But I have to imagine that Peter was still carrying a sense of weight of the shame. Maybe it was unspoken amongst the other disciples. And Peter had now seen Jesus. Maybe wondering in the back of his mind, is this conversation going to go up, or are we just going to bury it and forget about it? But so often our failures, even though we self-talk ourselves, are so hard to forget. They have to be dealt with. Well, we jump to an encounter where the disciples had been fishing all night, and now they are coming in, and Jesus meets them on the shore and actually has breakfast for them. And it's following breakfast that Jesus has this defining conversation with Peter. So let's jump into John chapter 21, beginning in verse 15. Just understand the context and then pull it back into our own lives to understand how our failures don't need to be fatal or final, but can actually make us faithful to following Jesus. This is what John tells us. After breakfast, Jesus asked Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," Peter replied. "You know I love you." "Then feed my lambs," Jesus told him. Jesus repeated the question, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" "Yes, Lord," Peter said. "You know I love you." Then take care of my sheep, Jesus said. A third time he asked him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was hurt that Jesus asked the question a third time. He said, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. Jesus said, then feed my sheep. I tell you the truth. When you were young, you were able to go as you liked. You dressed yourself and went wherever you wanted to go. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and others will dress you and take you where you don't want to go. Jesus said this to let him know by what kind of death he would glorify God. Then Jesus told him, follow me. It's in this amazing conversation that Jesus initiates with Peter that we begin to see how our failures do not need to become final or fatal, but that our failures can actually enable us to become faithful. It's interesting how Jesus responds to Peter. You see, oftentimes I think there are two responses to our failures. One is we ignore it, or our failures begin to bury us. You notice what Jesus doesn't do? He doesn't ignore our failures. And I think oftentimes that's what our culture likes to do. We like to justify. We like to excuse. We like to say, hey, listen, I get it. Let's just forget about it. Let's just move on. But Jesus doesn't do that. He actually identifies it 3 times. Not to rub it in, not to heap shame upon him, but to make it personal. In the very same way that Peter denied Jesus 3 times, Jesus is giving him the opportunity to declare his love and desire to be faithful to him. You see, the good news of Jesus is not in the midst of our failures. We just bury it. We just forget about it. We don't talk about it. No, we actually begin to deal with it. But on the flip side, do you notice that Jesus didn't bury Peter in shame? I think sometimes, maybe too often, maybe you have been turned off of the church or you've been turned off of Jesus because we have taken the past, we have taken the failures of our past, and we use shame as a motivator. Instead of inviting people to come to Jesus, we almost point the finger at them, thinking that shame produces obedience, but it never does. It creates even greater dysfunction. You see, Jesus in his conversation with Peter, he doesn't ignore it. He doesn't bury Peter with it. He gives him grace. Grace not only to forgive, but the grace to invite Peter to something even greater. You see, what I love about Jesus' conversation is we not only see forgiveness, but we recognize how Jesus then calls Peter to continue to serve him. That his failures did not disqualify him from being faithful in serving others. So how do we respond? How does Jesus want us to respond in the midst of our failures? To see the importance of confession. You see, so often I think we view confession as like a judgy word, as like a sticky word of like, I don't want that in my life. I don't want to confess. I don't want this to be a part of my life. But Jesus doesn't use confession as a means of bringing shame and guilt. He does it to kind of root out the failures in our lives, to bring about ultimate healing and grace. I believe that when we bring our failures to Jesus, and we receive his grace, they become defining moments in our life. Not only in how we remain faithful to Jesus, but it becomes a powerful opportunity for ministry. How? Well, first, out of grace flows humility. We begin to recognize our need for Jesus. But equally as important, I remember someone once said that people admire our success, but they relate to our weaknesses. You see that all the time. Just simply look at the room when someone is sharing their success, one of their achievements. People are kind of nodding along politely and are impressed by it. But when people start to share their struggles, their weaknesses, times where they have messed up, it's almost as if people start to lean in. They understand the reality of the brokenness of life and the brokenness of our world. And I believe that this was a defining moment, not just simply for Peter and his relationship with Jesus, but in defining his ministry to others. Peter goes on to write letters to the early church, and in one particular letter, in 1 Peter 1:3, he says this: "In his great mercy, speaking of Jesus, he has given us new birth into a living hope." I am convinced that Peter, in sharing the good news of Jesus, would have shared his shortcomings, would have shared how he failed Jesus at his time of greatest need. But Jesus not only forgave and redeemed, Jesus called him into greater ministry. The amazing part of this conversation is at the very end in verse 18. Jesus says something that at first may seem like, what exactly is he talking about? As Jesus says to Peter, after Peter has confessed his love of him, Jesus says this: "I tell you the truth. When you were young, you were able to do as you liked. You dressed yourself and went wherever you wanted to go. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and others will dress you and take you where you don't want to go." Jesus said this to let him know by what kind of death he would glorify God. In that moment, Jesus is speaking to Peter of saying, "I know you will be faithful." History tells us that Peter was martyred. He was killed for his faith, and he was crucified. And actually, unworthy of wanting to die the way that Jesus died, he died upside down upon the cross. Peter remained faithful. So what about you? How do you begin to see the difference that Jesus can make in your life? Do you start to see the good news of grace? That our failures need not be final, but that our failures can actually produce greater faithfulness when we turn to Jesus. You see, don't bury your failures. Don't let your failures bury you. Turn to Jesus. Confess. Allow grace to begin to enter into your life. And you'll begin to see not only the difference it makes in you, the difference it makes in others. You see, as a church, we talk about how nobody's perfect, and so everyone's welcome because anything's possible with Jesus. We believe that it's in the grace and the power of Jesus that our failures can be forgiven. Our failures can actually be redeemed to make an impact upon others. So where do you start? Like Jesus' conversation with Peter, he wants to get personal with you. If you've buried your failures, confess them to Jesus and allow his grace to wash over you. If you've been buried by your failures, oftentimes I hear people saying, "I know that God has forgiven me, but I can't forgive myself." It means your failures have buried you. Confess that to Jesus and allow his grace to begin to take hold of your life. And like Peter, you too will be a faithful follower of Jesus. What difference can Jesus make? He can change our lives. He can turn failures into faithfulness when we choose to trust in him. Let me pray as we conclude. And so, gracious God, as we come before you this day, I pray for those that are watching, that you know the circumstances of their life. I pray for those that perhaps have messed up and are just allowing their failures to begin to bury them and to identify them. Jesus, would you remove this guilt and this shame? Would they know that this shame does not come from you? Will they begin to experience your healing grace? I pray as well for perhaps those that have buried their failures, acting as if they make no difference. May we step out and recognize that these two need to be confessed to you. And Lord Jesus, may you use our lives as an opportunity to witness to others of your faithfulness in all situations. For we ask it, Jesus, in your name. Amen. Hey, listen, if there's something that you're dealing with and you want to talk or you want someone to pray for you and with you, please reach out to me. Send me an email. It's confidential. I will connect with you. I will touch base with you so that you can experience more of God's grace in your life. But may you know God's blessing and love today and in all of your tomorrows. Have a great rest of your day.